The summer of 19 full of clay. The full of clay. The first hours of the War of 1914. The summer of 1914 would have been memorable for us, even without the doom which had spread over the European earth. I had rarely experienced one luxuriant, more beautiful, and I am tempted to say, more summery. Throughout the days and nights, the heavens were a silver, forests dark and profuse in their tint. When I use the word summer, I think involuntarily of those radiant July days which I spent in concentrate on my work. I had retired for the month of July to this small romantic town where Beethoven loved to spend his summer holidays. Planning to pass the insinuates itself between the low Biedermeier houses which have retained the simplicity of Kerr Park, or slip into a solitary path. Already on the eve of that 29th of June, Austria celebrates as the feast day of Saints Peter. Many guests had arrived from Vienna. In light summer dress, gay and carefree, the crowds moved about to the music in the park. The day was mild. A cloudless sky lay over the broad chestnut trees. It was a day made to be happy. The vacation days would soon set in for the people and children, and on this holiday they anticipated the entire summer, with its fresh air, its lush green, and the forgetting of all daily cares. I was sitting at some distance from the crowd in the park, reading a book. I still remember that it was Merezhkovsky's Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and I read with interest and attention. Nevertheless, wafted toward me from the park. I heard them without being disturbed by them, for our ear is so capable of adapting itself that a continuous din, or the noise of a street, or the rippling of a brook adjusts itself completely to our consciousness, and it is only an unexpected halt in the rhythm that startles us into listening. And so it was that I suddenly stopped reading when the music broke off abruptly. I did not know what piece the band was playing. I noticed only that the music had broken off. Instinctively, I looked up from my book. The crowd which strolled through the trees as a single, light, moving mass also seemed to have undergone a change. It, too, had suddenly come to a halt. Something must have happened. I got up and saw that the musicians had left their pavilion. This, too, was strange, for the park concert usually lasted for an hour or more. What could have caused this brusque conclusion? Coming closer, I noticed that the people had crowded excitedly around the bandstand because of an announcement which had evidently just been put up. It was, as I soon learned, the text of a telegram announcing that His Imperial Majesty, the successor to the crown, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife, who had gone to the maneuvers in Bosnia, had fallen victims of a political assassination there. More and more people pressed toward the placard. The unexpected news was passed on from one to the other. But to be honest, there was no particular shock or dismay to be seen on their faces, for the heir apparent was not at all well liked. From the very earliest days of my youth, I can recall another day when Crown Prince Rudolph, the emperor's only son, had been found shot dead in Mayerling. Then the whole city was in a tumult of despair and excitement. Tremendous crowds thronged to witness his lying in state. The expression son and heir, who had been looked upon as an unusually progressive and humane Habsburg of whom much was expected, had passed on in the prime of life. But Franz Ferdinand lacked everything that counts for real popularity in Austria: amiability, personal charm, and easygoingness. I had often seen him in the theater. There he sat in his box, broad and mighty, with cold, fixed gaze, never casting a single friendly glance towards the audience or encouraging the actors with hearty applause. He was never seen to smile, and no photograph showed him relaxed. He had no sense for music and no sense of humor, and his wife was equally unfriendly. They both were surrounded by an icy air. One knew that they had no friends, and also that the old emperor hated him with all his heart because he did not have sufficient tact to hide his impatience to succeed to the throne. My almost mystic premonition that some misfortune would come from this man with his bulldog neck and his cold, staring eyes was by no means a personal one, but was shared by the entire nation, and so the news of his murder aroused no profound sympathy. 2 hours later, signs of genuine mourning were no longer to be seen. The throngs laughed and chattered, and as the evening advanced, music was resumed at public resorts. There were many on that day in Austria who secretly sighed with relief that this heir of the aged emperor had been removed in favor of the much more beloved young Archduke Karl. Of course, the newspapers printed lengthy eulogies on the following day, giving fitting expression to their indignation over the assassination. But there was no indication that the event was to be used politically against Serbia. The immediate concern of the imperial house was quite another one, namely the solemn obsequies. According to his rank as heir apparent, and especially if he died in the service of the monarchy, his burial place would obviously have been the Capuchin vault, the historic place of interment of the Habsburgs. But Franz Ferdinand had married a Countess Chotek in the face of a long and bitter struggle on the part of the imperial family. She was a high aristocrat, but according to the secret, ancient family laws of the Habsburgs, she was not considered of equal birth with her husband, and at all the great official functions, the archduchesses stubbornly clung to their precedence over the wife of the heir apparent, whose children were not entitled to the succession. The court pride even followed them in death. What? A Countess Chotek to be buried in the imperial vault of the Habsburgs, old emperor. Whereas official mourning was expected from the populace, within the palace there was a wild crossplay of bitterness and rancor, and, as usual, the dead were in the wrong. The masters of ceremony invented the assertion that it had been the express desire of the deceased to be buried in Artstetten, a provincial hole, and with this pseudo-pious excuse, they were able cautiously to evade the public line, in-state, the funeral cortege, and all the disputed incidents that went with it. The coffins of the murdered royalty were quietly taken to Artstetten and interred there. Vienna, whose perpetual fondness for a show was thus deprived of a great opportunity, had already begun to forget the tragic occurrence. After all, the violent death of Queen Elizabeth and of the Crown Prince, and the scandalous flight of all sorts of members of the imperial house, had long since accustomed Vienna to the thought that the old emperor would outlive his Tantalitian house in imperturbable of Franz Ferdinand would have disappeared for all time out of history. In less than a week, however, attacks suddenly began to appear. Was regulated too consistently for them to have been entirely accidental. The Serbian government was accused of collusion in the assassination, and there were veiled hints that Austria would not permit escape the impression that some sort of action was being taken in newspapers, but no one thought of war. Neither banks, nor business houses, nor private persons changed their plans. Why should we be concerned with these constant skirmishes with Serbia, which, as all knew, arose out of some commercial treaties concerned with the export of Hungarian pigs? My bags were packed. I came to Verhaeren in Belgium. My work was in full swing. What did the dead Archduke and his catafalque have to do with my life? The summer was beautiful as never before and promised to become even more beautiful, and we all looked out upon the world without a care. I can recall that on my last day in Baden, I was walking through the vineyards with a friend when an old wine grower said to us, "We haven't had such a summer for a long time. If it stays this way, folks will remember this summer." He did not know, the old man in his blue Cooper smock, how gruesomely true a word he had spoken. In Leucope, the small seaside resort near Ostend where I had planned to stay for 2 weeks before paying my annual visit to Verhaeren's country home, the same unconstraint reigned as elsewhere. The happy vacationists lay under their colored tents on the beach or went in bathing. Children were flying kites, and the young people were dancing in front of the cafes on the Diga. All nationalities were peaceably assembled together, and one heard a good deal of German in particular, for vacationists from the nearby Rhineland had long shown a preference for the Belgian seacoast. The only disturbance came from the newsboy who, to stimulate business, shouted the threatening captions in the Parisian papers: "L'Autriche provoque la Russie, l'Allemagne prepare la mobilisation." We could see the faces of those who bought copies grow gloomy, but only for a few minutes. After all, we had been familiar with these diplomatic conflicts for years. They were always happily settled at the last minute. before things grew too serious. Why not this time as well? A half hour later, one saw the same people splashing about in the water, the kites soared aloft, the gulls fluttered about, and the sun laughed warm and clear over the peaceful land. But the bad news piled up and constantly became more threatening. First, it was Austria's ultimatum to Serbia and the evasive reply to it, then an exchange of telegrams between the monarchs, and finally the barely hidden mobilization. The village became irksome to me. Every day I would take the little electric train for Ostend to be closer to the news, and it grew increasingly worse. People were still bathing, the hotels still full, the digas still crowded with strolling, laughing, chatting summer visitors. But for the first time now, however, a new element appeared. One saw Belgian soldiers who had never before been seen on the beach, and machine guns and small carts drawn by dogs, this being a peculiarity of the Belgian army. At that time, I was sitting in a cafe with some Belgian friends, a young painter and the poet Krommelink. We had spent the afternoon at the house of James Ensor, Belgium's greatest painter, a very reticent and retiring sort of man, who was much prouder of the poor and petty waltzes and polkas that he composed for the military band than he was of his fantastic paintings in glowing colors. Indeed, rather unwillingly, for the thought that somebody might possibly purchase one of them dejected him in a buffoonish sort of way. His ideal, so his friends laughingly told me, was to sell them at a high price and then be permitted to keep them, for he was as avaricious about money as he was about his work. Whenever he was forced to part with a painting, he was plunged into despair for several days. With all his curious crotchets, this genial harpagon had made us quite jolly, and when a troop of soldiers happened to pass by with its machine gun harnessed to a dog, one of us got up to stroke the dog. This disgusted the officer in charge, who feared that this petting of an adjunct of war might possibly damage the dignity of a military institution. Why all this stupid marching about? One of our group muttered. But another immediately replied with excitement. One has to be prepared. They say that in case of war the Germans intend to invade us. Out of the question, I said with honest conviction, for in that old world one still believed in the sanctity of treaties. If something were to happen and France and Germany were to destroy each other to the last man, you Belgians would still keep your feet dry. But our pessimist did not give in. There must be sufficient reason, he continued, if such measures had been ordered in Belgium. Years ago they had already got wind of a secret plan of the German General Staff, whereby, in case of an attack on France, Belgium was to be invaded despite all ratified treaties. But neither would I give in. It appeared completely ridiculous to me that while thousands and tens of thousands of Germans were enjoying at their leisure the hospitality of this small, impartial country, an army should stand in readiness at the frontier prepared to march in. Nonsense, I said. You can hang me to this lamppost if the Germans march into Belgium. Today I am still grateful to my friends that they did not take me at my word when the time came. Then came the critical last days of July, and each hour brought conflicting news. The telegrams of Emperor Wilhelm to the Tsar, the telegrams of the Tsar to Emperor Wilhelm, Austria's declaration of war on Serbia, the murder of Jowers. One sensed the serious situation. At once an icy wind of fear blew over the beach and swept it bare. People by the thousands left the hotels and stormed the trains, and even the most optimistic began to pack their bags with speed. I too booked a ticket the moment that I learned of Austria's declaration of war on Serbia, and it was high time for this. The Orient Express was the last train from Belgium to Germany. We stood in the corridors, excited and impatient, everybody talking to everybody else. No one could remain quiet or read, and at each station we would rush out of the train to get the latest news, filled with the secret hope that some determined hand would restrain the fates that had been unleashed. We still did not believe there would be war, and even less in the possibility of an invasion of Belgium. We could not believe it because we did not wish to believe in such madness. We had passed through Verviers, the Belgian border station, and gradually the train approached the frontier. A German crew got on, and in 10 minutes we would be on German soil. Halfway to Herbestel, the first German station, the train suddenly stood still in the middle of an open field. We hurried into the corridor to the windows. What had happened? In the darkness, I saw one freight train after another coming towards us. Open cars covered with tarpaulins, under which I thought I could indistinctly see the threatening outlines of cannon. My heart missed a beat. It could be nothing but the advance of the German army. But perhaps, I comforted myself, it was only a precautionary measure, merely a threat of mobilization, and not mobilization itself. Always in time of danger, the renewed will to hope. Finally, we heard the signal, all clear, and the train rolled on into the station at her Vestal. I leapt down the steps with one jump to get a newspaper and to learn what was going on. But the military had occupied the station. When I wished to enter the waiting room, an official, white-bearded and grave, stood in front of the locked door. No one was permitted to enter. But I had already heard the rattling and clanking of swords behind the carefully covered glass panes and the hard thud of grounded rifles. No longer any doubt. The monstrous thing, the German invasion of Belgium contrary to every provision of international law, was in progress. Shuddering, I went back to the train and rode on, back to Austria. Now there was no more doubt. I was riding into the war. The next morning I was in Austria. In every station placards had been put up announcing general mobilization. The trains were filled with fresh recruits. Banners were flying. Music sounded. And in Vienna, I found the entire city in a tumult. The first shock at the news of war, the war that no one, people or government, had wanted, the war which had slipped, much against their will, out of the clumsy hands of the diplomats who had been bluffing and toying with it, had suddenly been transformed into enthusiasm. There were parades in the street, flags, ribbons, and music burst forth everywhere. Young recruits were marching triumphantly, their faces lighting up at the cheering. They, the John Does and Richard Roes who usually go unnoticed and uncelebrated. And to be truthful, I must acknowledge that there was a majestic, rapturous, and even seductive something in this first outbreak of the people from which one could escape only with difficulty. And in spite of all my hatred and aversion for war, I should not like to have missed the memory of those first days. As never before, thousands and hundreds of thousands felt what they should have felt in peacetime, that they belonged together. A city of 2 million, a country of nearly 50 million, in that hour felt that they were participating in world history, in a moment which would never recur, and that each one was called upon to cast his infinitesimal self into the glowing mass, there to be purified of all selfishness. All differences of class, rank, and language were flooded over at that moment by the rushing feeling of fraternity. Strangers spoke to one another in the streets. People who had avoided each other for years shook hands. Every experienced an exaltation of his ego. He was no longer the isolated person of former times. He had been incorporated into the mass. He was part of the people, and his person, his hitherto unnoticed person, had been given meaning. The petty mail clerk, who ordinarily sorted letters early and late, who sorted constantly, from Monday until Saturday without interruption. The clerk, the cobbler, had suddenly achieved a romantic possibility in life. He could become a hero, and everyone who wore a uniform was already being cheered by the women and greeted beforehand with this romantic appellation by those who had to remain behind. They acknowledged the unknown power which had lifted them out of their everyday existence. And women with their fears were ashamed to manifest their quite natural emotions in the face of this first transformation. But it is quite possible that a deeper, more secret power was at work in this frenzy. So deeply, so quickly did the tide break over humanity that, foaming over the surface, it churned up the depths, the subconscious primitive instincts of the human animal, that which Freud so meaningfully calls the revulsion from culture, the desire to break out of the conventional bourgeois world of codes and statutes, and to permit the primitive instincts of the blood to rage at will. It is also possible that these powers of darkness had their share in the wild frenzy into which everything was thrown, self-sacrifice and alcohol, the spirit of adventure and the spirit of pure faith, the old magic of flags and patriotic slogans, that mysterious frenzy of the millions which can hardly be described in words, but which, for the moment, gave a wild and almost rapturous impetus to the greatest crime of our time. Today's generation, which has only observed the outbreak of the Second World War, may ask, why was our experience different? Why did not the masses in 1939 flare up with the same rapturous madness as in 1914? Why did they respond to the call only with gravity and determination, fatalistically and in silence? Was it not the same thing? Were not even holier and higher aims at stake in our present war, which is one of ideas and not merely concerned with frontiers and colonies? The answer is simple. Because the world of 1939 does not possess so much childishly naive credulity as did that of 1914. Then the people had unqualified confidence in their leaders. No one in Austria would have ventured the thought that the all-high ruler Emperor Franz Joseph, in his 83rd year, would have called his people threatening the peace of the empire. The Germans, on the other hand, had read the telegrams of their emperor to the Tsar in which he struggled for peace. A mighty respect for the authorities, the ministers, the diplomats, and for their discernment and animated the simple man. If war had come, then it could only be against the wishes of their own statesmen. They themselves were not at fault. Indeed, no one in the entire land was at fault. Therefore, the criminals, the warmongers, must be the other fellows. We had taken up arms in self-defense against a villainous and crafty enemy who had attacked peaceful Austria and Germany without the slightest provocation. In 1939, however, this almost religious faith in the honesty, or at least in the capacity of one's own government, had disappeared throughout Europe. Diplomacy was despised, since one had seen with bitterness how the possibility of a lasting peace had been betrayed at Versailles. Nations remembered all too clearly how they had been shamefully cheated of the promises of disarmament and the abolition of secret diplomacy. In truth, there was not a single statesman in 1939 for whom anyone had respect, and none in whom one would confidently entrust his destiny. The humblest French crossing sweeper ridiculed Daladier, and in England, since Munich, peace in our time, all confidence in Chamberlain's perspicacity had vanished. In Italy, and in Germany, the masses looked upon Mussolini and Hitler with anxiety. Where will he drive us now? To be sure, they had no choice. The fatherland was at stake. And so the soldiers shouldered their guns. The women let their children go, but not with the unswerving belief of other times that this sacrifice had been unavoidable. They obeyed, but without rejoicing. They went to the but without the old dream of being a hero. The people, and each individual, already knew that they were not but the victims either of mundane, political stupidity, or of an incomprehensible and malicious force of destiny. Besides, what did the great mass know of war in 1914 after nearly half a century of peace? They did not know war. They had hardly given it a thought. It had become legendary, and distance had made it seem romantic and heroic. They still saw it in the perspective of their school readers and of paintings in museums. Brilliant cavalry attacks in glittering uniforms, the fatal shot always straight through the heart. The entire campaign a resounding march of victory. We'll be home at Christmas, the recruits shouted laughingly to their mothers in August of 1914, who in the villages and the cities of Austria remembered real war. A few ancients at best, who in 1866 had fought against Prussia, which was now their ally. But what a quick, bloodless, far-off war that had been. A campaign that had ended in 3 weeks with few victims, and before it had well started. A rapid excursion into the romantic, a wild, manly adventure. That is how the War of 1914 was painted in the imagination of the simple man. And the young people were honestly afraid that they might miss this most wonderful and exciting experience of their lives. That is why they hurried and thronged to the colors, and that is why they shouted and sang in the trains that carried them to the slaughter. Wildly and feverishly the red wave of blood coursed through the veins of the entire nation. But the generation of 1939 knew war. It no longer deceived itself. It knew that it was not romantic, but barbaric. It knew that it would last for years and years, an irretrievable span of time. It knew that men did not storm the enemy, decorated with oak leaves and ribbons, but hung about for weeks at a time in trenches or quarters covered with vermin and mad with thirst, and that men were crushed and mutilated from afar, without ever coming face to face with the foe. The newspapers and cinemas had already made the new and devilish techniques of destruction familiar. People knew how the giant tanks ground the wounded under in their path, and how airplanes destroyed women and children in their beds. They knew that a world war of 1939, because of its soulless mechanization, would be 1,000 times more cruel, more bestial, more inhuman than all of the former wars of mankind. Not a single individual of the generation of 1939 believed any longer in a God-decreed justice of war. And what was worse, they no longer believed in the justice and permanence of the peace it was to achieve. For they remembered all too well the disappointments that the last war had brought. Impoverization instead of riches, bitterness instead of contentment, famine, inflation, revolts, the loss of civil rights, enslavement by the state, nerve-destroying uncertainty, distrust of each against all. That is what made the difference. The War of 1939 had a spiritual meaning, a question of freedom and the preservation of moral possessions. And to fight for an idea makes man hard and determined. The War of 1914, on the other hand, knew nothing of realities. It still served a delusion, the dream of a better, a righteous, and peaceful world. And it is only delusion, and not knowledge, that bestows happiness. That is why the victims, crowned with flowers and with oak leaves in their helmets, marched jubilating on their way to the shambles through streets that rumbled and sparkled as if on a holiday. That I myself did not succumb to this sudden rapture of patriotism was not due to any unusual sobriety or discernment on my part, but rather because of my former manner of life. 2 days earlier, I had still been in enemy country and could convince myself that the great masses in Belgium were just as peaceful and unaware as our own people. What is more, I had lived too internationally to be able suddenly, overnight, to hate a world that was as much mine as my fatherland. I had long been dubious of politics, and especially during recent years I had discussed countless times with my French and Italian friends the stupidity of a possible war. I was inoculated to some extent against the infection of patriotic enthusiasm, and being thus prepared against this fever of the first hours, I remained fully determined not to allow this war of brothers, brought about by munitions manufacturers, to affect my conviction of the necessity of European unity. As a result of my world citizenship, it was more difficult to determine my course as a citizen of the state. Although only 32, I had no military being, for at all physical examinations I had been declared unfit, whichever on those past occasions had made me heartily glad. These rejections saved me from wasting a year in stupid army service, and furthermore, it struck me as a criminal anachronism to let myself be trained in the use of implements of murder in the 20th century. The right thing for my convictions would have been to declare myself a conscientious objector, a course which, in Austria, invited the heaviest punishments imaginable and would have demanded a martyr's steadfastness of soul. It happens, and I am not ashamed to situations has always been to on this occasion that I had to accept, perhaps justly, the reproach of indecision that so often was made to my revered master of an earlier century, Erasmus of Rotterdam. On the other hand, it was equally unbearable to me as a comparatively young man to wait until they dug me out and planted me in some inept spot. So I looked around for some activity in which I could serve to advantage without being militarily active, and the fact that one of my friends, an officer of rank, was in the war archives, procured my assignment there. I worked in the library, where my knowledge of languages was useful and styled and improved publicity releases. Certainly not a glorious occupation, I readily concede, but at least one that seemed to suit me better than pushing a bayonet into the entrails of a Russian peasant. But the deciding factor was that I had sufficient time after these none too arduous duties to devote to what I believed was the most important service in the war, the preparation for the understanding to come. My position among my Viennese friends was much more difficult than my official one. Limited in their experience of Europe as a whole and living entirely within the German circle of thought, most of our writers believed that their best contribution was to strengthen the enthusiasm of the masses and support the supposed beauty of war with poetic appeals or scientific ideologies. Nearly all the German authors, led by Hauptmann and Demmel, felt themselves obligated, like the bards of the ancient Germani, by songs and runes to inflame the advancing warriors with enthusiasm for death. Poems poured forth that rhymed Krieg with sea and not with Tod. Solemnly, the poets swore never again to have any cultural association with a Frenchman or an Englishman. They went even further. They denied overnight that there had ever been any French or English culture. All that was insignificant and valueless in comparison with German character, German art, and German thought. But the savants were even worse. The sole wisdom of the philosophers was to declare the war a bath of steel, which would beneficially preserve the strength of the people from enervation. The physicians fell into line and praised their prosthesis so extravagantly that one was almost tempted to have a leg amputated so that the healthy member might be replaced by an artificial one. The ministers of all creeds had no desire to be outdone and joined in the chorus, at times as if a horde of possessed were raving. And yet all of these men were the very same whose reason, creative power, and humane conduct one had admired only a month before. The most shocking thing about this madness was that most of these persons were honest. For the most part, too old or physically unfit for military service, they thought themselves in decency obliged to take part in every supporting effort. All that they had achieved they owed to the language and thus to the people. And so they desired to serve their people by means of the language and let them hear what they wished to hear. That justice was solely on their side in this struggle, and injustice on the other. That Germany would triumph and the enemy be ignominiously conquered, quite oblivious of the fact that in so doing they were betraying the true mission of the poet, the preserver and defender of the universal humanity of mankind. Of course, many felt the bitter taste of disgust on their tongues at their own words as soon as the fumes of the initial enthusiasm had evaporated. But in the early months, those who raved the loudest attracted most attention, and so they sang and yelled in a wild chorus here, there, and everywhere. To my mind, the most typical and most moving case of such honest and at once inane ecstasy was that of Ernst Liesauer. I knew him well. He wrote short, incisive, brittle poems, and was the most kindly person imaginable. Even today, I can recall how I had to bite my lips to hide my smile on the occasion of his first visit. Arbitrarily, judging by his pithy Germanic verses which strove for the utmost brevity, I had pictured him as a slim, raw-boned young man. Instead, there toddled into my room a round little man, a jolly face above a double chin, bubbling over with self-importance and exuberance, stuttering in his haste, and so possessed with poetry that nothing could keep him from citing and reciting his verses again and again. But for all the laughable things he did, I had to like him because he was warm-hearted, comradely, honest, and demoniacally attached to his art. He was of a wealthy German family, had been educated in the Friedrich Wilhelm Gymnasium in Berlin, and possibly he was the most Prussian or Prussian-assimilated Jew I had ever known. He spoke no other living tongue and had never been outside of Germany. Germany was his world, and the more Germanic anything was, the more it delighted him. York, Luther, and Stein were his heroes, the German War of Liberation his favorite topic, and Bach his musical god. He played him beautifully in spite of his small, short, thick, spongy fingers. No one was more familiar with German poetry, and no one was more enamored of, more enchanted with the German language. Like so many Jews whose families had entered German culture late, he had more faith in Germany than the most devoted of Germans. When the war broke out, his first act was to hurry to the barracks to enlist. I can well imagine the laughter of the sergeants and corporals when this fat body came puffing up the stairs. He was promptly rejected. Liesauer was in despair, but, like the others, he at least wished to serve Germany with his muse. Everything that the newspapers and the German army communiques published was gospel truth to him. His country had been attacked, and the worst criminal, as cast by Wilhelm Strass, was that perfidious Sir Edward Grey, the British foreign minister. This feeling that England was the arch enemy of Germany and responsible for the war found expression in his hymn of hate, a poem. I do not have a copy before me, that in hard, short, impressive stanzas raised the hatred against England to an eternal oath never to forgive her for her crime. It was soon faithfully apparent how easy it is to work hatred. This blinded, fat little Jew, Lee Sauer, anticipated Hitler's example. The poem exploded like a bomb in a munitions depot. Possibly no other poem in Germany, not even the Watch on the Rhine, got around as quickly as this notorious hymn of hate. The Kaiser was enraptured and bestowed the Order of the Red Eagle upon Lee Sauer. The poem was reprinted in all the newspapers. Teachers read it out loud to the children in school. Officers at the front read it to their soldiers, until everyone knew the litany of hate by heart. As if that were not enough, the little poem was set to music and, arranged for chorus, was sung in the theaters. Among Germany's 70 millions, there was hardly one person who did not know the hymn of hate, from the first line to the last, and soon it was known, with less rapture, be it said, to the entire world. Overnight, Ernst Lee Sauer had achieved the greatest renown won by any poet in that war. But, to be sure, a renown that later was to burn him like the for no sooner had the war ended, with merchants seeking to resume trade and politicians making honest efforts towards mutual understanding. Everything was done to disclaim the poem which had demanded eternal enmity with England, and to shake off one's own culpability. Poor Hate Sauer was pilloried as the sole culprit of this insane hysteria of hate, which in fact everyone from the highest to the lowest had shared in 1914. All who had celebrated him in 1914 turned from him pointedly in 1919. The newspapers ceased to print his poems, and when he appeared among his fellows, a marked silence fell. Finally, he was driven out by Hitler from the Germany to which he had been attached with every fiber of his heart, to die forgotten, the tragic victim of the one poem which had raised him so highly only to dash him to the lowest depths. The rest were just like Lee Sauer. Their emotions were honest, and they thought they were acting honestly, the professors and poets, the sudden patriots of that time. I do not deny it, but it took little time for it to become apparent how terrible a disaster had been caused by these songs in praise of war and orgies of hatred. In 1914, all the warring nations were already in a state of over. Excitation and the worst rumor was immediately transformed into truth, the most absurd slander belief. In Germany, men by the dozen swore that they had seen with their own eyes automobiles laden with gold going from France to Russia shortly before the outbreak of the war. The tales of gouged out eyes and severed hands which appear on the third or fourth day of every war filled the newspapers. They did not know, those innocents who spread such lies, that the accusation of every possible cruelty against the enemy is as much war material as are munitions and planes, and that they are systematically taken out of storage at the beginning of every war. War does not permit itself to be coordinated with reason and righteousness. It needs stimulated emotions, enthusiasm for its own cause and hatred for the adversary. It lies in human nature that deep emotion cannot be prolonged indefinitely, either in the individual or in a people, a fact that is known to all military organizations. Therefore, it requires an artificial stimulation, a constant doping of excitement. And this whipping up was to be performed by the intellectuals, the poets, the writers, and the journalists, scrupulously or otherwise, honestly or as a matter of professional routine. They were to beat the drums of hatred, and beat them they did, until the ears of the unprejudiced hummed and their hearts quaked. In Germany, in France, in Italy, in Russia, and in Belgium, they all obediently served the war propaganda and thus the mass delusion and mass hatred, instead of fighting against it. The results were disastrous. At that time, propaganda not yet having worn itself thin in peacetime, the nations believed everything that they saw in print in spite spite of thousands of disillusionments. And so the pure, beautiful, sacrificial enthusiasm of the opening days became gradually transformed into an orgy of the worst and most stupid impulses. In Vienna and Berlin, one fought France and England in the Ringstrasse and the Friedrichstrasse, which was definitely more comfortable. The French and English signs on the shops were made to disappear, and even a convent zoo, Den Englischen Fräulein, had to change its name because the people were aroused, not knowing that English referred to the angels and not the Anglo-Saxons. Sober merchants stamped or pasted got strafe England on their letters, and society ladies swore, so they wrote to the newspapers, that never again would they speak a single word of French. Shakespeare was banned from the German stage, Mozart and Wagner from the French and English concert halls. German professors declared that Dante had been Germanic, the French that Beethoven had been a Belgian. Intellectual culture was requisitioned without scruple from the enemy countries like grain and ore. It was not enough that thousands of peace-loving citizens were killing each other daily at the front. In the hinterland, there was mutual berating and slandering of the great dead of the enemy countries, who had been slumbering in their graves for centuries. The mental confusion increased in absurdity. The cook at her stove, who had never been outside the city and had never looked at an atlas since her school days, believed that Austria could not endure without Sanjak, a small frontier hamlet somewhere in Bosnia. Cab drivers argued on the streets about the reparations to be imposed on France, 50 billions or 100, without knowing how much a billion was. There was no city, no group that had not fallen prey to this dreadful hysteria of hatred. The ministers preached from their pulpits, the Social Democrats, who but a month before had branded militarism as the greatest crime, clamored perhaps louder than all the others so as not to be classed as people without a fatherland, in the words of Emperor Wilhelm. It was the war of an unsuspicious generation, and the greatest peril was the inexhaustible faith of the nations in the single-sided justice of their cause. It soon became impossible to converse reasonably with anybody in the first war weeks of 1914. The most peaceable and the most good-natured were intoxicated with the smell of blood. Friends whom I had looked upon as decided individualists and even as philosophical anarchists changed overnight into fanatic patriots and from patriots into insatiable annexionists. Every conversation ended in some stupid phrase such as, "He who cannot hate cannot really love," or in coarse inculpations. Comrades with whom I had not quarreled for years accused me rudely of no longer being an Austrian. Why did I not go over to France or Belgium? They even hinted cautiously that sentiments such as that the war was a crime ought to be brought to the attention of the authorities, for defeatists, that nice word had just been invented in France, were the worst betrayers of the fatherland. Nothing remained but to withdraw into oneself and to keep silent while the others ranted and raved. It was not easy, for even in exile, I have experienced it to the full. It is not as difficult to live alone as it is in one's own country. In Vienna, I had estranged my old friends, and this was no time to seek new ones. It was only with Rainer Maria Rilke that I sometimes had talks of intimate understanding. It had become possible to secure him, too, for our war archives, for with his over-delicate nerves he would have been the most impossible soldier, since filth, smells, and noise actually produced physical nausea in him. I always have to smile when I remember him in uniform. One day there was a knock at my door. A timid soldier stood outside. For the moment I was frightened. Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke, in military disguise. He looked so touchingly awkward that he had to salute every officer, clicking his heels together. And since, in his high impulse to perfection, he wished to perform even this insignificant formality of the ritual in as exemplary a manner as possible, he found himself in a perpetual state of confusion. "I military uniform," he said to me in his soft tone of voice, "since my time in the military academy. I thought that I had escaped it once and for all, and now again, at almost 40. Fortunately, there were helping hands to protect him, and once more he came into my room, this time to take leave, back in civilian clothes again. It seemed almost as if he had been wafted in, so noiseless were his movements. He wished to thank me for endeavoring, through Roland, to rescue his library, which had been confiscated in Paris. For the first time, he no longer looked young. It was as if the thought of all this horror had exhausted him. Abroad, he said. If one could only go abroad. War is always prison. Then he left. Again, I was all alone. After a few weeks, determined to escape this dangerous mass psychosis, I moved to a rural suburb to commence my personal war in the midst of war, the struggle against the betrayal of reason by the current mass passion, the struggle.
Okay, finished today. And I hope you guys, if you have time, to listen about this novel, the World of Yesterday by Zweig, and the chapter 10, the first hours of the war of the 1914, and themes, the situation about the 1914, the first of the war just started. The situation of the world, of the Europe, looks like now. Even now, we thought we are always stay in the peace world, but not really. The war already started. So hope you guys can listen about this novel. Good. But my cat thought, that's not my business. The moment I opened a book, it's a nap time. See, reading book is really sleep. Business. How about the war of the third of the war?